It'll be interesting.
Oh my gosh. Technology is defeating me.
Still early for these students.
Oh, so smart.
And cold.
Technology is defeating me. Can you give me a hand run? I just wanted to play it.
I'm gonna go stand up there.
I don't think that's necessary.
We can just sit here.
Yeah,
I'm happy with
they
that.
have it rolling
Okay,
here.
that's great.
Yeah.
I like that.
Just present it.
Do you know Milan Verveer?
Of course I do.
Yeah, thank you. It was.
You know, it's
That
very
is going to be a big
strange.
part of it.
I can
ma'am.
teach with
We worked really hard on
eyes
it.
closed.
Yeah, how long
I
you
don't
working on
need notes.
Well, we
I
met in
can't do
2008,
that.
but
Yeah.
we started actually writing about a year
I actually
and a
have
half ago.
notes because this is a real project that
Yeah.
has, you know, I'm not just sort of
A year and a
talking
half
about
ago, not
myself.
bad.
You know, when you talk about yourself,
I mean, we've been
and
working on the
experiences,
instruction.
you're
We've
actually
got
talking about
30 years, and I've been working on it
Right.
for 20 years.
And
So,
like
So
it's
you
just
the
best for me to
knowledge
do
is
it
there.
that
but
way.
it seems so obvious.
I'm
Like,
from Delhi.
I've been to India 3 or 4 times.
Have you?
Well, writing people underestimate the power of
2013.
analytics.
So fairly recently. My boyfriend, about a year now, in India. So that's very
Something that's going to keep people in
He's really
My normal reaction would be
No,
to
not
say,
for the
oh, for
I
you.
know you. He's honestly, I've never met him as such a heart and soul.
That's
I'm totally serious.
And I shouldn't say that because
Challenging.
my husband and sons are like that. But yeah,
She's speaking first, right? So she'll
No, he's a revelation. It's really interesting. Yeah,
Okay.
I know.
No, thank you. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the keynote address. Our first panel of the day will address women's economic empowerment and the various models used to address women's issues on the global platform. The panel will be moderated by Geethanjali Chanda, who is a senior lecturer in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at Yale, where she's taught courses on popular culture and fictions of Indian women since 2001. Please join me in welcoming Geeta and our panelists.
thank you, Nilofer. And my personal thanks not only to the panelists, but to the organizers of this panel who've done a wonderful job, and to all of you for braving it on this Arctic morning. It was really cold when I came and I had to thaw out before I could actually start. So in this first session, we have 3 practitioners who, through their work, have shown that ideas do translate to practice and can have a huge impact on individual lives and in transforming the economic development of the country. I would like to introduce each of them one by one, give them their 5 minutes, and then at the end, open the floor to questions, if that's all right by all of you. Each of them should get special time. So we're going to start with Kim Azzarelli, and I've just heard that Kim's latest book, Fast Forward, is coming out next Friday.
No,
So
it's due next Friday.
due next Friday.
It's coming out in
Okay.
September.
So I think a round of applause for Kim would be great. Kim is a founding partner of Seneca Point Global. She's also the chair of Avon Global Center for Women and Justice. She served as senior vice president of Tina Brown Live Media and the Newsweek Daily Beast Company. I could list all the degrees and high-profile positions she's held at prestigious companies, but rather what has been her guiding force has been not so much the name of the firm, but what the firm stood for. For instance, she joined Latham & Watkins because she was impressed with the firm's large corporate and pro bono practices. Similarly, she joined Avon because, as she says, and I quote, "It's a company dedicated to improving the lives of women, and it was a great opportunity to combine my corporate work with the ability to help empower women. Kim provocatively asks, clearly, women are good for business, but is business good for women? And we hope that she'll help answer that question. Welcome, Kim.
Okay, well, thank
Yours.
you. I was looking forward to hearing about them. Well, thank you. That was a very thoughtful introduction. And I actually might want to borrow that because you just summarized so well what I think. But anyway, so it's wonderful to be here today. I'm so excited. I've had the chance to talk with the organizers of the program today, and I was really I was excited to come, of course, because it's Yale and it's a great institution and a great panel. But when I spoke to these guys on the phone, I got really excited about the potential of what's possible in this room and among you. So let me just be quick about this. Interesting. Well, anyway, it says why women, why now? But the point is that we are at an inflection point for women, and we're at an inflection point for the world. What I want to talk about is not just sort of women's issues, although not to say that it's just women's issues, but I'd like to talk about what women mean for the world right now, and what the world and women can do together. So I think, and many have said that 2015 is the year of the woman. And why is that? It's the 20th anniversary of Beijing, which many of you may know was the infamous UN convening where Hillary Clinton said that women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights. It doesn't seem like such a big statement. It seems crazy that you would say that 20 years ago when it would make news. But I was actually in law school at the time, and it was a very, very big deal. And since then, there's been a huge proliferation of human rights laws around the world, and we'll talk about what's happened since then. But this year is also a big year because the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, are being recast, and they're including gender in a new way, in an interesting way, and as well as the private sector. It's a historical year for women in politics, as we can clearly see. But we've had a lot of progress in the last 20 years. We've had women rising in leadership, many, many firsts of all different types. We've had the development of international human rights laws, as I mentioned, a huge proliferation of NGOs focused on women and girls, a technology revolution, which is self-evident, women moving from victims to agents of change, and that's what we're going to talk about a bit today, and an increasing role of the private sector, and that's really where I'm here to talk about, which is the intersection between the private sector and women. And then what I think is one of the biggest game changers in the last couple of years is the data. So the data's in. We know that investing in women is no longer just the right thing to do, and I say that very delicately because we know it's the right thing to do, but the data now shows it's the smart thing to do. From The Economist to the World Bank to Goldman Sachs to Deloitte, you can go on and on and on. All the data's in. And this is just over the last 5 years. So when I was at Avon, I was at Avon for a long time, but really it was really Avon making the case. But now organizations like this are making the case. 75% of purchasing power, 28 trillion in spending, it's pretty apparent. So what does this mean for countries? Christine Lagarde put out a great presentation last year about what economies can do if they put women at the center of their strategy. And President Abe took up the call. First time that Japan said we need to put women at the center of our strategy if we really want to advance our economy. This is a sea change. What does it mean for companies? Look at the companies on this list. Of course, I'm very proud of Avon in the business of empowering women, but we're talking about Exxon, Toyota, Citi, Walmart, Bank of America, Merck. These are not necessarily women's companies. You wouldn't traditionally think of them as the women's space. So what do all these companies have in common? They now understand that if you put women at the center of your strategy, it is going to obviously increase the social benefit of the world. We know that's true. The UN has been talking about that, and all the women's NGOs and all great organizations have always known that investing in women pays a double dividend from a social perspective. Women invest 90% of their income back into their communities, back into their families. But now these companies also understand it's critical for business. And it seems very obvious. I'm sure you're sitting here thinking, well, of course, women are 50% of the population, control 75% of purchasing power. But the fact is, women have not been at the center of strategies or at the center of management or at the center of, frankly, anything corporate until very recently. So the media is beginning to take notice. Again, the top line are all the sort of women's media movements, and I've, of course, been very involved with women in the world. But look at the other organizations on this list. I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post. These are organizations that when I was at Avon, again, we could not get coverage. Not interested in women's issues, not interested in advancing women and girls. Not because it just was not on the agenda. And we have to thank people like Nick Kristof and many, many others who have really fought to make women, again, an important news item. So we have a lot of progress. The data's in, the opportunity is huge. Nonprofits and the private sector are focused on women and girls, and the number of women are really rising in leadership roles. And the media is beginning to take notice. So there's a lot of energy around these issues, but what we need now is to convert the energy into action, into actual strategy, in boardrooms, in business schools, in companies, because honestly, as we said before, it's not just the right thing to do, it is really the smart thing to do. I think Nate talked earlier about the double bottom line, the triple bottom line. I really believe that if you want to talk about shared value, there's no better partner in shared value than women. So this is kind of a very weird presentation, but so what does this really mean? In my mind, it's about connecting power and purpose. No longer does success have to live on one side of the world and purpose have to live on the other. We now know you can do both. You can have a great career and you can have impact. And I really believe that one of the best ways to do that is to partner with women. And we always talk about having a China strategy or an India strategy, but what companies are starting to realize is they have to have a women's strategy. Women are a rising 1 billion person market. Okay, you look at the Booz Allen report and the next page, and you see that this is a moment in history. So my challenge to all of you, or my invitation to all of you, is to sort of rethink the way you think about business and rethink the way you think about your role in business. You have to learn about what your own power is, where women sit in the economy, and then find your own purpose. Whether it's women or another purpose, find your purpose, because that's what's going to get you motivated, get you up in the morning, and help you sort of be your best self. That's a very short version, very short version of what I could talk about for the next several hours, and that is in a very long book. But on that, I'll turn it back over to you guys.
Thank you. So our next speaker is Judithe Registre. She's the program director for Because I Am a Girl campaign at Plan International USA. Because I Am a Girl is a global initiative that creates sustainable projects in developing countries to give girls and boys access to the most basic of human rights: clean water, food, healthcare, education, financial security, and protection from violence and exploitation. Ms. Registre's professional experience includes 10 years of substantive fieldwork, living and working in conflict and post-conflict and developing countries, including Rwanda, Sudan, South Africa, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. She's also Director of Policy and Outreach at Women for Women International, UK. Judith feels that, and I quote, "Not investing in adolescent girls is tantamount to planning for poverty. We hope she'll help us understand the cycle of intergenerational poverty and how good business practices can help alleviate, if not end, this vicious cycle." Judith?
Well, thank you. I think you've just gave my presentation. So, yeah. Well, I'm really excited to be here and particularly to follow Kim's conversation. And I want to thank you, the organizer, for inviting us here. It's a great opportunity. I'll just briefly touch base on some of my background, sort of where I am, and build from what she was talking about, because I think it's an important connection when we talk about why women, why now, and when do we invest in women. So my basic theory is that we need to actually start the conversation way earlier. And that's the conversation is with girls. So to invest leadership, women's leadership, we actually have to start much earlier. To wait for women, to wait for girls to become women is much too late in the process of trying to actually create an enabling environment and trying to achieve gender equality. I started my career primarily focusing on women, partly because I was interested in children. And I felt that, children's vulnerability, through my own analysis, I studied philosophy for undergrad and graduate school. Don't ask the connection, but there is actually a big connection. It's about understanding social structure and who we all connect to the environment that we'll come from. And I think the earlier keynote speaker talked about our environment and the link to our environment and who we become. And I was quite interested in the vulnerability of children. And through my process, it became very clear to me that children's vulnerability was linked to their mothers. And then I got into this whole working on women's issues to try and to increase economic opportunities for women, so thereby their children can get greater livelihood. Well, through my process and work with women, it became real that, wow, it's way too late. Because if we wait for these women who are without any opportunities to have children, it's much too late in the process of the conversation. So then I got into this whole space of adolescent girls. In particular, my work around adolescent girls have been to look at holistically what are the interventions and when all these interventions are necessary for us to have change. In too many societies, by the age of 13 or 15, many girls are engaged, married, and in the process of having children. If you're a girl, you're married with kids at 15 with no education, the likelihood that your children will be poor is more or less 70 to 100%. And in some cultures, in some economies, for example, where girls end up at the age of 15 with a child, their children end up in poverty. And so how do we actually break that cycle to ensure that what Kim is describing in terms of women becoming sort of like the demographic and the power that they can be in society? And that basically means we need to invest in girls in an early age. By the time a girl is 12, if she's forced to drop out of school, the opportunities for her are very limited. So much of the work I've been involved in is really looking at what are the opportunities for girls. In particular, we look at issues such as financial literacy. To the point of this conversation, financial literacy, it's linked holistically to economic well-being, social network. We work particularly in environments like Egypt, Sierra Leone, Nepal, building what we call social clubs. And the interesting thing we've learned through some of our studies, when a girl is young, she has a lot more, her mobility and access to space, her ability to move is much greater than when she gets older. As she gets older, her mobility is actually reduced partly because of the risk associating with being a woman. And I think, I can talk about this in the context of Egypt or Sierra Leone, but think about you as a woman in this university. How often do you think it's too late, we can't go out because of the risk of what could happen? And this challenge of space and mobility for women is quite striking of an issue. So when you talk about a woman's ability to participate in the market space, if there's limitation in their mobilities, how is that become a possibility? So the work that we do both with the leadership of community leaders, working with religious leaders and administrative leaders, is to actually help to create space, access to space. And what we do with a lot of the girls we work with is build girl space and social club. So we do focus group discussion. We work with girls around savings group. And what the savings group does in so many ways, it's not just about the saving in and of itself, which is kind of like the necessary skill. What these groups do in so many aspects, it's actually build the social network. And I think many of you here will graduate, you'll belong to an alumni network. And that alumni network will create access for you that you individually would not have in and of yourself. You can call on to the alumni network, so-and-so is working in technology and you're interested in technology. Just that affiliation create that access that you would not otherwise have. So many of these girls often, because, if you're a girl, it's still, you're young or you're not young, going out means that the risk that the association that you would be considered a loose girl means that there's no space for you to go out. Your family protects you out of that spirit of the perception that society would have of you if you're a girl going out there unaccompanied by a man or by an older person. So without these kind of network, girls are become increasingly more vulnerable. So our work is really about not only providing the skill, but I think to build on what you were talking about, the power of the network. Without that network, there's limitations of what can be achieved. So, I know the time is limited and I would like to engage in a greater conversation and dialogue with you. And I brought you some really fascinating brochure around this work. It looks at issues from sexual reproductive health, economics, water and sanitation, and what happened from a girl when a girl is born. In many environments, birth certificate is actually not something that exists. What does that mean in terms of her own identity? So issues like trafficking become a key issue. So in too many places, if a girl does not exist, we know the statistic, the data are in. But the data are in not just about economic participation, but the data are in of what happened when a girl doesn't even have an identity. If you don't have an identity, imagine that you're here if you didn't have a birth certificate. So these very simple things become a very key component to what we mean and what we do around creating socially an enabling environment, building a social network that her identity is known, that she's recognized. And these issues, what do they mean around economic empowerment? It means confidence. And the core, very fundamental piece of the process, participations mean having the confidence to actually enabling that. So these social networks that we built around group savings, it's really about building that confidence that girls need to actually transition from girlhood to womanhood. And those skills, when we talk about political participation, leadership, it's quite challenging when we talk about, women are not in the political space because they don't have the skills. From an earlier age, a boy is actually, he knows that he's going to be a leader. But too often we raise our girls that that's not the path that is to follow. But that leadership, when it's built, she actually is able to make that choice in and of itself. So much of the work that we've been doing in some way is to help the work that Kim is doing. So we step early on and sort of we need to build that leadership in the capacity of girls at an early age so that they can indeed transition from adolescent to womanhood and essentially to become agents of change in playing a leadership role in their society. And so I would like to, hopefully to get more engaged in a dialogue and answering your question and answer to really get into more details in exactly how that happens for us to really understand what does it mean to transition women from girls from women so that we can actually indeed have that sort of power dynamic in terms of changing the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Our third panelist is Lys Anderson, who is Program Manager for the Indigenous Industries Task Force for Business and Stability Operations for the U.S. Department of Defense. In their recent work in Afghanistan, the task force has sought to identify and modernize Afghan industries and increase value of traditional Afghan goods. Afghanistan and carpets used to be almost synonymous. So picking up on existing and known industries, the task force has sought not only to include women in reviving the industry, but also in reviving skills. In this patriarchal and war-torn society, the quiet inclusion of women is a bold move. But as Lee notes, the government and men are or have become co-collaborators in this move, which is good for the country as a whole. So Lee will help us explore the alignment of the Department of Defense with philanthropy and women's empowerment.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here and happy to be able to speak about this program that's centered on providing jobs for women. And I think it's going to be a really interesting contrast from what these two ladies have been saying. I mean, this is very, I don't even know if they would probably call it empowerment. And I'm sure we're going to get into how do we even really refer to what does empowerment mean, right? There's a lot of different definitions about what women's empowerment is. And and certainly job creation is a path towards women's empowerment, but then what does that mean? How do they have domain and control over that money that's earned then, right? And probably in Afghanistan in this sector, not so much, but there was a few bright spots, which could be a path towards the future maybe. And I'm going to put it in context of working in one of the most troubled places in the world, right? So I wanted to first, though, tell a little bit about the context of the organization I was working in, because it's a little bit different. So it's a donor's perspective, right, of what you've got to look at when you're coming in to do a project in a place, and all the different things you need to consider, and your incentives, and on-the-ground incentives, and in order to sort of make this work. But let me just tell you, you've got the, all right, sorry. So, as Gita mentioned, so the organization I work for is called the Task Force for Business and Stability Operation. It just ended in December, a few months ago. Part of the U.S. Department of Defense. Its mission, as you can see there, it's basically economic development work. Very interesting work, not normally done by DoD. We worked primarily in areas of natural resources development, industrial development, and indigenous industries, which is the program I headed up. By the way, you have two of your SOM colleagues here. One of them is right there, Ben Friedman, wave here, yeah. He worked for the task force before coming here to Yale. The other is Adit Bashir. I'm sure he's going to come sometime today. He's not here yet. But they both worked on the energy team, and so I talked to them. It's a fascinating organization and just a really kind of different, we're doing really different type of work in Afghanistan. So while those types of programs sometimes takes years and decades to actually develop a country's natural resources, especially in Afghanistan. Lack of infrastructure, lack of regulatory framework, political infighting, political intrigue. Rapid expansion of indigenous industries can produce revenue and jobs right away. And I'm going to take a lot of sips of water because I have a sore throat and cold, so just bear with me. So we focused on modernizing and increasing the value and volume of traditional Afghan goods that had been left out of the international marketplace for 30 to 40 years and bringing them along. So one of them was carpet weaving, which is obvious, as you mentioned. Afghanistan has this incredible lore tradition of making beautiful handcrafted carpets. It's an art, actually. And I'm not talking about machine made. I'll get into that a little bit. So this is handmade, an artist sitting basically in front of the lid making carpets. Cashmere production, who would know, the world's third largest producer of cashmere. But it really had been left behind in those value-added processes. It was being sold on the market in the world for very low prices. High-end crafted artisan products as well. One of the the point was to make economic opportunities for women, namely jobs, while we do these projects. One of the wonderful projects we were able to do is we were able to fund and develop a center at the American University of Afghanistan called the International Center for Afghan Women's Economic Development. And I'm not going to talk about that today because it's a center, and yes, it advocates for policy change, and it's a business incubator, but it's pretty new. And I think when I talked to the organizers and looked at sort of what you all had sent out, I mean, you wanted to really have on the ground implementation and scalability, like examples. And it's really tough stuff, especially in a place like Afghanistan. And so I will just, let me see, maybe the next one. So all I'm gonna do is focus loosely around these things. I'm gonna center my talk just sort of around these loose points. And the reason I also want to talk about this initiative is because we were able to employ 8,000 women through this, which is a pretty big number, when you're doing a development project, right? And Afghanistan is a tremendously conservative country, both religiously and culturally. It's a long history now of subverting women's rights in both civic life, business, politics. We know that. Things have gotten a bit better. Women are more educated now since the end of the Taliban. But still, they're really, really limited from the workforce. And this is especially true in rural areas, which is another reason why I wanted to talk about this project, is rural areas in many of these countries, it's a whole different thing than sometimes Kabul or Delhi even, or other countries, and certainly in countries in Africa as well, and what's available to women. And the carpet sector, you don't want to say this, but in Afghanistan, you have to look at the context. It's accepted. It's culturally accepted. It's allowed. Women can work in their home. We might not like it. It might not be what I would choose for women, right? But it's allowed. And I promise you that if you want to go in there and force your own viewpoints, you will be subverted at every turn. These are slow things. These are generational changes that have to be made. We may not like it. It may not seem like progress to us. I think it is in some ways, in the things we're doing. But so anyway, my point is, it doesn't seem for us like these women are working in their home. But what we did is we found that, for instance, in a place like Balkh province, which is where Mazar-e-Sharif is, it's a center for carpet weaving. Women have to work in their homes there. It was very restrictive. But we also found ways to bring together women, though, in Kabul, which is less restrictive. We worked with a certain community called the Hazara, which are not as culturally strict. And we were able to have women come together and form cooperatives and actually have more control over how they were going to spend their money that they earned together cooperatively, how they were going to interact with the carpet producers, etc. So even within Afghanistan, you could see that there could be a way forward, perhaps different models that could be implemented. So we also knew that a lot of women weren't working. They had these skills, but the business just wasn't there. And though we had to look at the marketplace, we said, well, we can't, that's what you see a lot in development, right? You think this is a great idea. As you go in and you want women to work, you have all these great intentions, you stir up a lot, and then it kind of doesn't work out because perhaps the market forces aren't there to support it. And so we said, well, what can we do? Like, what is it that, this is an important sector. It was still, not thriving like it had been 40 years prior, but what can we do? What is something different? It's really been left out of the loop since the 1970s. And so we looked at we had to really delve into the market. And what we found is that there was a great opportunity. Handmade carpet production was going down in the major carpet producing countries, which are China, India, Pakistan, Turkey, and Iran. We weren't able to import carpets from Iran anymore due to sanctions. China was moving to actually a government-mandated policy towards machine-made carpets. I can't believe it, but of all things. I mean, so, the handmade carpet market is the niche fashion luxury end, and that's what I'm talking about in Afghanistan. Even Turkey, it's not government mandated, but it's been moving away from handmade carpets to machine-made. Even in India somewhat, although it's still a huge amount of handmade carpets out of there. So we saw a huge opportunity to reintroduce the Afghan brand to the marketplace. And I should also mention that Afghan carpets for most of the last 30 to 40 years have been going to Pakistan for export. And once they go to Pakistan for export, even if they're made in Afghanistan, they're sold as made in Pakistan. There's some final processing pieces that are done there, and then they're exported through Pakistan. So they'd lost brand recognition. They had lost all those end value-added processes, which could have been 30 to 50% value add, right? So we knew that we were then going to have to do, there was a great opportunity, the market forces were there, but we had to do some interventions along the value chain. We had to do some training. They had to learn new techniques. They were very much still stuck in the 70s. And we had to build 2 cut wash facilities, and that was to cut out that piece that was going to Pakistan so we could do domestic processing, keep the value chain in country. Teach them actually how to proper wool selection, going all the way back to the sheep, how to actually pick proper wool, sort the wool, process that wool, spin it, dye it, etc. So we did that type of training. We did business training, obviously, and we did quality control training. We also had to strike a deal with Ariana Airlines, which is a national airline of Afghanistan, so that we could get really competitive rates to Dubai and the freight forwarders, carry it on from there, which we did, compared to anything else. So those are the things that we looked at, was just really making the strong business case for this. Then we, simultaneous to this, went and found the right companies. And the first companies that we went out to were companies that actually historically had been in Afghanistan. They hadn't been able to go for years, so they hadn't been selling Afghan carpets for a long time, but they had this immense, passionate connection to the past and when they used to go to Afghanistan and go to all the carpet, to Mazar and Tehran, all over the country and pick out the carpets. They're very, very committed to the mission of helping women and wanted to even come there. I mean, we brought 5 or 6 of these companies that we ended up working with there, and so that really, there's a lot of buy-in that comes from that, working one-on-one with the weavers and with the artisans. And so we did this over a period of about 3 years. About a year ago, we started to really back away from the relationships we had built between those international companies and the Afghan artisans and companies, because we wanted to, that was part of it, build those relationships, be there to nurse it along, back away, but be there just to sort of, make sure that, because we knew we were ending just a few months ago. But so far, we're only 2 months, right? But we ended up having over $2 million of orders placed, 17 companies that ended up coming on board, and like I said, over 8,000 women employed in this. And we still have the 2 people, the 2 experts that we had working in this are still on the ground in Afghanistan, now being employed by an Afghan NGO to carry on working on this. And so I have very, positive feelings about that this will go on. These companies, I cannot even tell you how passionate and devoted they are to this and how they needed new sources of production, and there's such a practicality behind it. They're committed to the corporate social responsibility piece of employing women, and and the business case is there behind it. So I think that's kind of, we can get into sort of, is that really very empowering for women? And I think I'm just trying to point out that in a country like Afghanistan, where working in the home, maybe it's not what we want for them, but for now, we were 8,000 jobs is a lot of jobs. And like I said, we were able to see another model that might have been actually something that we could spread around the country and that could possibly, work, that cooperative model, which works so well, of course, in other places as a development tool.
So we are open for questions, but I know the first question is always slow in coming. So the one thing that I wanted to pose, not so slow in coming. Anyway, the one question I did want to pose to sort of clear the brushwork, because we've talked about it earlier, is what do we mean by the word empowerment?
I'll quickly sort of touch base on this question because it's something that I've wrestled with throughout my career. And at an earlier point in my career, I had this thing I wanted to sort of be the voice for the voiceless and empower people. And through my experience, I've learned that it's actually a very dangerous place to go. And that empowerment is an inside job. And our job is to support the process of creating an enabling environment so that people can recognize and use their own power. So where I come from with the conversation, which is why I think my work with girls is such a key point is like people have their own power they want to realize. People have potential that they want to realize. How do we actually, through the process, make sure we have a society, whether it's through the rule of law, protection, all kinds of system in place, that the infrastructure is in place so that all of us who are here, can make the decision that we feel that are right for us. And I think in too many environments, that's really the struggle. The enabling environment is there, so we get in that conversation of needing to empower people that actually very much know what they want and what they want to do with their lives. So that's really my take on the issue, and I don't think working from home is actually, a disempowerment.
I know. I just think sometimes when you sort of, read studies, I mean, I think that it's something that we think of as, we don't want women to be at home and not be out and be able to be in charge of their own free will. And then I certainly think that if they must work at home for religious or cultural reasons, maybe that goes hand in hand with not being able to make their own choices about how that money that they're earning is spent or who's in control of
And
that.
that's where we need the data to actually
Yeah.
clarify if that's indeed the case, right? So-
Absolutely.
yeah.
Sure. And a lot of times when you're working, the point is to in home, but you can't get a lot of data. You don't really know what's with how that's working for a woman. If it's working very well for her.
So, such a short amount of time, and there's so many intersecting issues. So, first of all, it's such a smart panel that you picked because it's going to be about the public sector, the private sector, and the NGO community. And I started by saying it's not just the right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. But on the right thing to do side of the equation, which is where I started all my work, which is why I chaired the Center for Women and Justice at Cornell, you have to have fundamental access to justice. Obviously, violence against women is an epidemic. I mean, that could be a 3-hour conversation just right there. Educating girls is by far the smartest investment of all the investments. If you had to actually summarize the best investment that you could possibly ever make, I do believe it's educating girls, and that's the fastest way to fast forward, which is the name of our book, not pun intended, but how you can fast forward the world we want to see. The reason why I'm focusing my remarks today on the private sector in particular is because, just to say sort of clearly, the private sector holds a lot of power and resources. And again, it's been until very recently, in the past 15 years, it's been a very sort of segregated idea that the private sector does this and is for profit, and the public sector is for purpose, and the two shall not combine. And I am here to tell you that, first of all, there's a change in that thinking, but also my plea is that you demand that there be a change in that thinking, because if we keep a segregated world between power and purpose, first of all, I think we're redefining what power even means now. I think the millennial generation, thank God, has a different understanding of what they want and what they're willing to tolerate. But I also think as women achieve power, they also start to expand their power to include purpose. And that's really the topic of our book, which is how do you know your own power? What does that mean on a macro level? But what does that mean on an individual level? And then how do you find your purpose and infuse it into your work so that you can actually unleash both? And I found through all we've done, we've interviewed over 60 women for the book, and obviously my partner is Ambassador Milan Verveer, who you may or may not know, but she was the first global ambassador for women, and collectively we've traveled to over 100 countries who talked to thousands and thousands of women and men. And I want to touch on this idea of mutual self-interest, because that is such an important concept. The idea that I started also by saying it's not a women's issue. I really believe that it's not a women's issue. I believe this is a societal issue, and I think the values that we're talking about are values that everybody actually really wants to see. But in Afghanistan, for example, I know if Ambassador Verveer was here, and I think she worked with you on that project, she would say that the most important thing in diplomacy is showing mutual self-interest, right? So explain to people, she just told the story the other day, that when she would go and say, I'd like to meet with the economics minister, and they would say, oh, you're the minister for women from the United States, we have a young woman we'd like you to meet with. The economics minister really doesn't have more than 5 or 6 minutes to speak to you, but there's a great staffer who will take the time. She said, oh, no, I'm sorry, I think you've misunderstood. I wanted to talk about economic growth in your country. He said, really? We'd clear the schedule for that. So the idea that you can lead with economic empowerment, that you can lead with this is not just the right thing to do, but President Abe, again from Japan, or Prime Minister Modi, starting to say that we need to include women if we want to grow our economies, that's the mutual self-interest that works on the national level. But on the corporate level, and the reason why I'm so keen on these corporate examples, if you look at Coca-Cola's 5x20, for example, they've looked at the value chain of Coca-Cola. Muhtar Kent, CEO of Coca-Cola, when he set his 2020 goals, he realized he won't reach those goals unless he includes women. And he created a business-driven initiative for women to empower and to connect with 5 million women entrepreneurs by 2020 in the value chain of Coca-Cola. Or let me pick another one, which I love, which is Abbott. I love Abbott too, by the way. That's another one. I was going to say Vodafone. In India, and I was just sort of mentioning this casually before we started the talk, there's a great project with an organization called Sewa. And you spoke of women's networks. Now, of course, I'm an Avon person, so there's nothing that I believe more in than the power of women's networks. But in India, there's a great organization called Sewa, which some of you may know about, the Self-Employment Women's Association. 1 million women strong organization of women who it was started by Ilabat in the 70s, and she basically created something like a micro-lending, Muhammad Yunus type environment for women, and it grew and grew and grew, where they now have all different kinds of education, all different kinds of programs. But the Vodafone program, which I thought was very interesting, was about getting information to women farmers. And so it's very hard to know what price to sell your crop at if you don't have access to information. And a lot of these women, including women who are trying to sell into the larger value chain from crops to agriculture, and you name it, a lot of the problem is in the middlemen and the pricing. So they don't have access to large markets. There's a lot of corruption in sort of thinking about what price is fair. Anyway, Vodafone decided that they would create smartphones for the women farmers who were part of the Sewa project. And there were some naysayers who said, well, listen, if you give this poor farmer a phone, she's not going to know what to do with it. How the hell is she ever going to even think about the pricing? It's not going to happen. They said, really? Let's see about that. So they created a smartphone, very simple one for the needs that she had. Within 6 weeks, they increased their income, if I have my facts right, by 300%, just by knowing the price of the crop. So you see these ideas you can only do that through a technology company. So this idea that Vodafone, who wants to sell phones into rural India, would partner with Sewa to provide this newly designed phone is a completely win-win. It's a mutual self-interest project. There's another great one, and then I'll stop, which is another one of my favorite moments of my day. I used to be a high-yield bond lawyer and a corporate lawyer, and I used to do lots of deals. And now I consider myself doing deals for good. So my favorite deal was to connect 1 million women, craft women, on a conference call to do a deal where we convinced this company, and it wasn't really hard to convince them, because frankly, they wanted to put those women's products online, to get them together with, again, it was Sewa, it happened to be Sewa, to get these women's crafts online to a global marketplace. And the woman from Sewa, who's a really fascinating leader, said, Kim, you have no idea how quickly we can change lives if we just had access to marketplace. So, my dream, I wake up in the morning, I get on a conference call, we hammer out the deal, and the deal is now 1 million women have access to markets. That to me is a win-win, and that's what I'm talking about, not segregating success from purpose, because you can do both, and we need to demand that we do both. Sorry, I get excited. I could go on for a while.
So your first question.
Question.
That was actually my question. What was the definition?
Empowerment.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so
Could you identify yourself just so we know who
my
you
name
are?
is Judithe Registre. I'm a student here at Yale. And one of the things that I struggle with on the issue of women is how do you ensure that it stays on the development agenda and it's not just like a flavor of the month on a moving target. And so I used to work at the World Bank prior to coming to Yale, and I worked on a study there that did like a review of all the projects in the bank and looked at how many of them actually touched on the issue of gender. And in an organization as the bank that has more than thousands of projects around the world, only 8 had women on the project development objective. And this is an organization that is actively pushing and advocating, and we saw like the quote in the statistics for gender. So how do you make sure that it doesn't become like a checkbox that is checked on projects and that is actually part of the objective?
Did you want anyone in particular to answer? Anyone want to take a shot?
I'll try.
Okay, Judith.
Because I think there are 2 things, I think, for me. One is data, the other one is data. The third one is also data. What do I mean by that? I think if we just do age, sex, disaggregated data in all of the things that we do, I think, one of the things Kim have been talking about between purpose and power is what I call we need to move away from the moral argument in and of itself to the sort of hardcore economic arguments, right? So when we do these programs, and I work with a nonprofit, which I've been working with all my life, very familiar with the World Bank, what we do, we look at this issue as isolated outside the social construct, outside the society itself, outside human beings who are experiencing things. And we see women as victims or peripheral. We need a ministry here and there's little budget in that ministry. We don't see it as a cross of all that we can do. And it's not a women and girls issues. It's beyond that. It's like when you start getting the age, sex disaggregated data, you start to understand where our resources are being spent. What are the challenges and opportunities? And I think that data, that's why we've been challenged. And I think for me, when you say where and how can we do it, we can just start there. And that's kind of like neutral, right? You see here that we have youth centers that are designed for youth. And the data showing you that girls do not have access, small boys have access, and it's older boys that have access, it's more privileged boys that have access. But yet, you've designed the center for a broad population of people. If you're really interested in everyone having access to it, then you need to understand why these group of people are not coming in. And I think for me, that data and understanding who's impacted by what, at what level, is the beginning of where and how we can begin to rethink and redesign our program, creatively, that is.
I could not agree more. I could not agree more, and that's what I sort of stay up about at night. I mean, I always say, you don't want women to be sort of a fashion, and the next thing is pick your cause. Not that they are all not important causes, but the point is that, this has to be a long-term solution. And that's why, again, for me, and I do come from a very rights-based background in the sense that I believe in, equal justice and everything else. But for me, the only argument that's a staying argument, and whether you like it or not, is the economic argument. And that is because, we need to drive gender into long-term sustainable projects. So you talk about, our previous speaker. It was funny, I gave a talk about 4 or 5 years ago, right after the guy from Greenpeace. And at that point, I was working at Goldman Sachs. And the speaker next to me said, if they start throwing things at you, I'm not going to step in front. But it was a similar speech that they gave about the greening and why green is such an important long-term sustainable. It has to be integrated into the business model. It cannot be an afterthought. All the things that we say about green, and now people do it, right? They realize it's a profitable strategy to green your housing development. It's a profitable strategy. That is the way we need to think about women and gender, and it's such an interesting thing that this week for me, because I was talking to a group of women executives on Wednesday morning, and I gave a much longer version of that conversation, but these were senior executives, between, senior to mid-level, but a lot of senior executives. And one of them, who I will not name, was the head of a very important, big housing, government housing agency. I was so excited. She said, Kim, she raised her hand in an audience just like this. She said, I never thought of it this way, but I should be thinking about how I can put gender on the housing agenda and how I can show the bottom line of gender. And I thought, you know what, you can kill me today, because if I die today and she decides that gender is the ROI, that she's going to show how gender ties the ROI of that state's housing, that's the sustainable play. So that's why data and ROI, which we never really used in connection with women, and we have to be careful, right? Because we're not saying we don't want, we have to keep the other issues on the burner too. We have to keep girls' education and show the ROI. And we also can't get away from the fact that these are rights-based. It is the right thing to do. Human rights are human rights. Not being able to leave your house, gender-based violence, forced marriage, child marriage, these are basic human rights violations. We have to have that conversation, but we also have to have the economic conversation. And that's why this group of people in this institution is so important. And I think that's the sustainable play.
Can I add one quick thing to your question before you ask your question? One key thing, I think, right now in the US, we're talking about sort of the crisis on college campuses with rape, right? Yeah. Now, here's the challenge with the issue around gender and this data point. We hear too often 1 in 3 women will be raped in their lifetime. And the issues talk about as if it happens from the sky. If we begin to actually really draw the conversation out, if we start to look at how many men will rape these women, who will rape these women, if we shift the conversation just so slightly to sort of say, the majority of men who are not engaged in these, they become to feel like something needs to be done about that. So there are some core issues, the way we frame the conversation itself, I think is problematic, and rape is actually one of them.
No. I mean, I think even on this side, sometimes in my own organization, when I would talk about, because I was kind of doing stuff that was a little bit with my women's focused projects and even the Women's Center that was a little bit outside of what we did.
Challenging for the DoD.
It was, and even within my organization, and there was a little, people get a little prickly about it. You know, and I never wanted to talk about it from a social justice viewpoint or a rights viewpoint, even though why not? But it was only that economic viewpoint. Like, you know, and even like in Afghanistan, talking to people and talking to men, it's like, well, well, tell me about some of the economies around the world that you admire. You think that are, and it's never Saudi Arabia, it's never Afghan themselves. It's the U.S. And I would say things. So it is framing it that way, right? And even though we don't mind making men prickly here, maybe, or making people uncomfortable, it's just sometimes you really have to recognize how you have to frame the conversation in order to really, drive your point home.
But we're making major progress. I have to say, we were at Davos a couple weeks ago, and we hosted an event around partnerships for good, which, by the way, was a fascinating event in and of itself. But the idea that women, there was the joke is that at the shortest line at Davos is a ladies' room, and it's actually true. But the fact that we're talking about women at Davos as an economic development or an economic strategy is really, like I said, a sea change. And I lived it because I was at Avon for all that time, and I drank the Kool-Aid way before I got to Avon. But when I got to Avon in 2003, Andrew Jung was my boss, was the youngest CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and one of the only women for 13 years. And Avon was in the business of empowering women, so it was natural to talk about the bottom line of Avon and empowering women. But quickly and very quickly, when you think about new markets, how do you go into new markets, sort of the white space of corporate America? We have to thank Prahalad and Stuart Hart, for the bottom of the pyramid. The book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. But when you look at the bottom of the pyramid, who's at the bottom of the pyramid? That's what people started to wake up to, which is, wait a second. If you want to partner with the poor, as Prahalad said, for profit, you really also need to be thinking about partnering with women. And Unilever, Shakti, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, they do a great job at getting the word out about their program. Thinking about how to sell the Unilever products through a micro-distribution system. All that stuff is the sustainable integrating into the business. But what I think will change things, and I commend you to Gina Davis's work if you haven't looked at it. Gina Davis has some really great work around women and the media. And what she says, and what I found remarkable, we were sitting at some event, and there's this, Deb Spar put out that book, and she really highlighted the 17%, everywhere you look around the world, if you look at leadership organizations, it's always 17% women. Whether it's a board, whether it's a country's government, whatever it is, it's usually 17%, and she has a theory around that. But what Gina Davis told me, and that's when I started really seeing, obviously we know the power of the media, turns out that if you look at crowd scenes in films, it's 17% women. So, the statistics that Gina comes out with, the data from Gina's Institute, shows you that the way the media, it's just by the nature of the people who are making the decisions, we're programmed to see things in a certain way. So she says, it'll take 50 years to get women to 50% in the Congress, but I can do that in a movie tomorrow. And that can change thinking. So, this concept, you have to go bottoms up and top down. And I think that top down is the World Bank. I think Jim Kim and Bob Zellick and all those guys who stood up and said women matter, honestly, 10 years ago, nobody was saying that. So people listen. When Muhtar Kent speaks from Coca-Cola, when Lloyd Blankfein, I always say if Goldman Sachs has done the math, investing in women makes sense. So when those guys step up, it's a big deal from a messaging perspective from the top down, and then you need the bottom up. You need the people on the ground who are doing the real work. Not that that's not real work, but who are working with women on the ground everywhere, providing the enabling environments for them to have empowerment, empower themselves. And I could not agree more with what you said. It is not about empowering other people. It's about providing the opportunity that anybody can empower themselves and getting rid of the barriers. And I think that's where the hard work is. But you need the top to message the right message and to believe. And I think we actually are making progress. And that's why this book and this moment and I think we're at a historic moment right now again. And I think either we move forward or we move backward. And there's no other option. So
I'm sure you all have lots of other questions. Sure.
This is a question for Judith and Lee.
Could you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Zin. I'm a second-year MBA student. I'm curious to hear about the responses of boys, men, Afghan men to your initiatives. And second question, kind of more broadly, Kim, you mentioned framing women's empowerment as an economic development issue. What other strategies have you all seen to be effective in including men in general?
Well, I think I already said, in the case of this particular project, it's accepted. It's allowed, it's accepted. It's a form of employment, which is why we were able to reach the numbers that we were able to reach. It's not threatening. So that's why it works. I don't really, and that's in this particular project. And to sort of wider discussion, sort of when you're talking about Milan meeting, ministers and whatnot, it is relating to people, not on you're doing something wrong, there's something wrong with your culture. Because if you're doing that, you're not understanding the deep where this is coming from, and we're never going to understand it. And so you have to come at it again from that way of framing it in economic terms, And this is for men in Afghanistan. This is for men too. Men need training. Men need all of these things there as well. So I think we have a lot of success in this because it is allowed, and that's it's okay. It's accepted, and slowly, like I said, there's other examples of it like that pushes it out of the home a bit into a cooperative space where women can, and that's allowed too. It's not completely, only in the home, and so.
Judith?
Okay. I'll try to be quick. I think
We have only 5 minutes
Yeah, we
left,
have only 5 minutes. Okay, so 2 levels to your questions. One is, men as agents of change, or these issues about women. So the first part for me is, at least from on-the-ground work that I've been involved in, on the issue of violence in particular, building women's confidence have not proven to actually be the solution to violence. And part of it, when we're talking about sort of like the increase of violence against women, the question is often, is it an increase because there's more reporting, or is it an increase in actual violence? It's unclear what that is. So on our work, both, particularly in Latin America, there's been a great deal of the work we've done on violence focusing on boys, adolescent boys, and their own sort of like effort to redefine masculinity. We don't do enough work to understand the impact of violence on men of themselves, because a man who actually have to perpetrate violence, in my layperson analysis, a man who's really truly disempowered. And so how do we understand men's own experiences of violence? And through our conversation with boys in places like El Salvador, they'll talk about how they've witnessed their mothers being abused by their fathers, and how they try to protect her when they are young, and as they seek to actually transition from adolescent to manhood, they don't have an alternative model to redefine that space. So what do we do to actually help them to redefine what is masculinity? So that's the first answer to your question, because I think a lot of work needs to be done for that, not for the sake of women, because too much of the discussion is about, men supporting women's empowerment, men supporting, feminism, but it's really, for me, about men supporting their own self-agencies, because they also, I think, on some level, victim of of violence, because they witness it, and that has an impact on them. The last piece to the question I'll talk about is around women entrepreneurship. One of the things in the work I've done, in the data I have been out there, when women become entrepreneurs, a lot of the data has proven that they actually bring the family in the business. And so it actually serves a whole lot that men don't often actually bring their wives and the family in the business, where actually women do that. So again, to the point around the economic argument, it's whether it's brainwire, I don't know what the reasons are, but there is significant data to show that, women entrepreneurs, and when women become economically well, it actually translates into the husband's well-being as well. So maybe, Kim, you can add a little more on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, first of all, it's a great question. And one thing that I think about a lot is childcare. I think it's on everyone's mind. And it's a known mark of shame that we in Papua New Guinea, and I think one other country, doesn't have maternity leave, mandatory maternity leave. And that's been on the table for, I don't know, decades. But I think as what's happening now, again, with this next generation and my generation, and I think also the baby boomer generation, is starting to realize that, first of all, this is affecting men. The way we've structured our economy, the way we structure our lives, it's a design flaw. It's designed from one perspective. So it's designed from a perspective, think about, I really should know that 50s show, but you have like your sort of stay-at-home mom, and you have your husband who goes out and works.
Leave It to Beaver.
Leave It to Beaver. It's like a Leave It to Beaver. I don't know if you guys know what Leave It to Beaver is, but it's a Leave It to Beaver type Mad Men kind of fiction. And almost nobody even lived back then. So we've designed a work day that's 9 to 3, 9 to 5, try 9 to 10 these days, and a school day that's 9 to 3. Why would you do that? That's a design flaw. So we have to rethink the way we look at systems, and it's not helping anybody. So it's really not about women. There's so many men who are like, my God, my kids, I got to think about. It's the same problem. Everybody has that problem, especially now that parenting is really a different kind of parenting. Co-parenting is much more, what's going on. The other thing that's interesting is how we define roles. I talked to an executive, a very well-known and really accomplished executive, and he was really kind of the interview for the book. He just really believed in the topic, and he was really kind in the sense that I grilled him for a long time. And one of the things he said was, Kim, I didn't choose the role I had. I might have liked to have a different life too, but that wasn't an option for me either. So these are predefined roles of what is power, what is purpose. I think they're outdated. Everything is a little outdated, and there's a great professor who died recently from Cornell named Sandra Bem, who wrote this great book called Lenses of Gender in the 80s. You might have remembered Sandra Bem. And she's the one who said, she was like 4'5" or something. And she said, listen, if I lived in a village of short people, and we couldn't operate the fire engines, would we let our houses burn down? No, we would design it for the village in which we live. And that's what's been going on with the way we work and the way we think and the way we live, which is it's designed from a perspective that, frankly, nobody lives. Nobody has that lifestyle. Who has that lifestyle? It's like, 5% of the population. So it's really, again, I say it again and again, it's less about women's issues, although it is about women's issues, but it's more about the life that everybody wants to live. And I think that's just fact. And I think your generation is the generation that can make it happen. And I'm banking on that, because otherwise it's going to be a very disappointing old age that I'm going to have. So that's why I think more than events and organize things like this, it's a big contribution.
We're almost at the end of time, but if anyone has a last burning question, please speak up. Well, I do actually. We haven't talked about national and international networks and how this empowerment is looked upon. We've talked about how it's looked upon from the male perspective and from the female perspective, but what about from the national and international perspective?
Also our favorite topic, I'm sure of this. But, I have lots to say about networks, and in fact, the last chapter of the book that is due next Friday, which is why I won't sleep between now and then, is all about networks. And if the organizers are willing to send you a link, we're launching something in a couple weeks that I think is right on spot. But I think the point about networks is that my new sort of tagline, just to organize my own mind, is power plus purpose plus technology, because we have never in history had this ability to work on a global scale. Now, we have access to everything, and we have access to almost anybody. No matter where you are, there's a certain level of access to people. And I think we do have this chance. I mean, the rate of change is accelerating and accelerating and accelerating. And the vast global world is becoming extremely, extremely small. So I think networks are extremely powerful. I mean, I can go from direct selling networks, the networks of Seneca Falls, which is what our project is named after, to the networks that you're talking about, the social clubs, the political networks, obviously the social networks. I mean, you can go on and on and on. But I think what's really important about all this vast networking is that it's not a question of what can be done. It's a question of what you can do. And we have to make these vast networks small for ourselves, because you can't make change. We have to shift. We've gotten very, very big, but we have to go from very, very big to also very local, because everything actually happens through people and actual, so anyway, that's a whole another conversation, but I hope you'll continue to follow and we can maybe engage in some other way on that.
Just quick on the network piece for me, it's kind of like the learning that's happening across societies, because too often it was sort of like the West and then the rest. Now I think the rest are learning, the West are learning from the rest. And I think for me, that's kind of like an interesting model. Even when you look at family, I always say the nuclear family structure was the worst thing that happened to women in the West. Because even though they had women empowerment, they had jobs, it's like they still were responsible for the burden, and they didn't have that extended family structure to support them. And I think there's an extension now that's happening where I think women are learning from other women. Women in the West are learning from women in the rest of the world to sort of say, like, that extended family network can be a good support network. And if we really, serious about, the global feminism dialogue, that we actually need to learn what works well and for whom.
Do you have a last word, Lee?
No, I can't add anything to what these two ladies.
We would have heard from you, though.
Yeah, what about you? I think you might have something to say about
Fortunately, we are out of time. But it's been a great pleasure to have three such wonderful panelists here, and I know you'll join me in thanking them for their time, their thoughtfulness, and the enlightenment that they've brought to us here today. Thank you all.
I just saw that you are the Department of Defense. You just saw it?